Good afternoon and most welcome to the Heidegger series, and we will have a look at today how does perception look under the microscope of Heidegger Wittgenstein. And actually today we have a strand which is called action perception, which is very close to the idea of perception of Heidegger and Wittgenstein. I think it could be helpful to hear this philosophy of the both great men explained in more the jargon of ordinary cognition science, and that the comparison can help with the understanding. This is an article of Sarah Jane Blakemore and Jean Decety. It's called From the Perception of Action to the Understanding of Intention. Humans have an inherent tendency to infer other people's intentions from their actions. Here we review psychophysical and functional neuroimaging evidence that biological motion is processed as a special category from which we automatically infer mental states such as intention. The mechanism underlying the attribution of intentions to actions might rely on simulating the observed action and mapping it onto representations of our intentions. There is an accumulating neurophysical evidence to support a role for action simulation in the brain. This is very close to Heidegger's Dasein. What is Dasein? And I would say it's action perception. We discussed earlier that Dasein is not the subject, neither is it something that one could conclude from either the polarity object-subject or action/perception. It is rather action perception. You will see what I mean with that when I go through the review. And this is most often called action perception theory or simulation theory. Simulation theory meaning that we simulate our reality and thereby constructing that is valid on an objective sense. Whereas compared to the representational idea, always regresses into the private language problem, or why not the pupil whose rules I mentioned before seem to have an altogether different conception of what rule following is. We can only follow the general rules if we start with a simulation. Let me go into the article. Humans have an inherent ability to understand other people's minds. This process is a component of a theory of mind, a well-researched topic in both developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Theory of mind research and theory has mainly been applied to high-level cognitive processing, such as understanding that other people can have different desires and beliefs from one's own. This review will focus on a much lower, although equally important, level of theory of mind. The ability to understand others people's intentions by observing their actions. Indeed, this basic form of theory of mind might be the prerequisite for the higher level understanding of others' minds. We start by describing psychophysical and functional imaging studies showing that biological motion is processed as a special category to which humans from an early age attribute mental states, such as intention. Next, we suggest a mechanism for inferring intentions from observed actions that might depend on the system that labels the consequences of one's own actions as being produced by one's own intentions. This mechanism might be based on simulating the observed action and estimating the actor's intentions on the basis of a representation of one's own intentions. A notion that is reminiscent of simulation theory. Finally, we review the evidence that simulation and imitation, or overt action simulation, facilitate intentional attribution. in particular, neurophysiological evidence provides support for the existence of a matching system between perception and action, which is recruited during imitation. What is special about biological motion? The visual perception of motion is a particularly crucial source of sensory input. It is essential to be able to pick out the motion of biological forms from other types of motion in the natural environment in order to predicate the actions of other individuals. An animal's survival depends on its ability to identify the movements of prey, predators, and mates, and to predict their future actions. The consequences of which are radically different and could in some cases be fatal. As social animal, humans behave largely on the basis of their interpretations of and predictions about the actions of others. The Swedish psychologist Johansson, sorry, I didn't know we had the same name as me, devised an ingenious method for studying biological motion without interference from shape. He attached light sources to actors' main joints and recorded their movements in a dark environment. He then showed them doing configurations to naive subjects who rapidly and without any effort recognize the moving dots as a person walking. Using the same technique, several researchers have shown that observers can recognize not only locomotion but also the sex of the person, their personality traits, and emotions and complex actions such as dancing, represented by moving dots. The perception of biological motion is not restricted to adults. Three-month-old babies can discriminate between displays of moving dots showing a walking person and displays in which the same dots move randomly. These studies indicate that the detection of biological motion may become hardwired in the human brain at an early age. As has been suggested, such a mechanism would be useful in evolutionary terms and is a classic example of a perception for action system. Allowing us to recognize the movements of others in order to move towards or away from them. Given the evolutionary importance of detecting biological motion, it is logical to expect specific neural machinery for its perception. Single-cell studies in the monkey superior temporal polysensory area, which receives input both from the dorsal and ventral visual streams. Have identified cells that respond selectively to biological motion. In humans, brain imaging studies have attempted to investigate whether the perception of biological motion is subserved by a specific neural network. One such study used functional magnetic resonance imaging to compare brain regions activated by dot displays showing biological motion and regions activated by dot displays showing coherent motion, in which all the dots moved at equal velocity in the same direction. The authors found a specific area that was responsive to biological motion. Located within the ventral bank of the occipital extent of the superior temporal sulcus. This activation was more pronounced in the right hemisphere than in the left hemisphere. A second fMRI study compared dual displays showing biological motion with dot displays showing rigid object motion, in which an object appeared to rotate. The responses to rigid motion were localized more posteriorly in the occipito-temporal junction than the responses elicited by biological motion. Activation that was specific to seeing biological motion was detected in the posterior portion of the STS, more prominently in the right hemisphere and in the left intraparietal cortex. A third fMRI study showed that imagining biological motion activates the same region in the STS. Other neuroimaging studies have detected activation in the right posterior superior temporal sulcus in response to seeing hand, eye, and mouth movements. Clearly, the right posterior STS is important for the detection of biological motion. The area which is believed to be the human homologue of monkey area STP receives information from both dorsal and ventral visual streams. Rendering an interface between perception for identification and perception for action. This combination of visual information would be useful for recognizing the movements of other animate beings and categorizing them as threatening or enticing, to predict their future actions and make an appropriate response. Static images convey dynamics. The brain seems to be hardwired to perceive motion even in stationary stimuli. Freud conducted a series of studies showing that still photographs that capture an object in the process of motion induce a perception of movement. When subjects view static images that convey dynamic information, such as an athlete in the posture of throwing a ball, the brain region that is specialized for processing visual motion the occipital-temporal junction is activated. In contrast, images conveying non-dynamic information, such as a person sitting in an armchair, do not activate this area. In other words, the region specialized for visual motion processing is activated by implied motion from static images. This shows that the brain stores internal representations of dynamic information. Which can be used to recall past movements and anticipate future movements, even from very partial visual information. Visual perception of apparent motion can also result from the sequential presentation of static objects in different spatial locations. A clear perception of motion arises from the rapid display of static frames on film, for example. When presented with sequential static images of an inanimate object in different positions, the object is perceived as moving along the shortest or most direct path. Even when such a route would be physically impossible. For example, when it would require or object to pass through another. The visual system, therefore, seems to be biased towards selecting the simplest interpretation of the image when it involves inanimate objects. However, the perception of apparent motion operates differently when the object presented a human figure Schiffer and Freud have shown that viewing images depicting apparent motion of humans, depending on the time interval between the stimuli, gives rise to the perception of either a direct path, biomechanically implausible, or an indirect path, biomechanically plausible. This model was adapted by Stevens et al. To investigate whether a difference in brain activity accompanies this perceptual difference. Using positron emission tomography, PET, they found neural encoding of apparent motion to be a function of the intrinsic properties of the stimulus presented. Object versus human. As well as the kind of human movement path perceived, that is biomechanically possible versus impossible. premotor and inferior parietal cortex were involved only in the perception of biomechanically possible motion, indicating that these regions are selectively activated to process actions that conform to the capabilities of the observer. This in agreement with the idea that the perception of human movement is constrained by an observer's knowledge of or experience with his or her own movement limitations. Inferring intentions from biological motion. It has been proposed that the detection of biological motion might have evolved to allow us to infer other people's mental states. When we view biological motion such as Johansson's walkers, we attribute mental states such as intentions and desires to the observed movements. For example, when you see someone lifting a glass, you may infer that their intention is to drink from the glass. Humans even infer complex internal states from displays of simple two-dimensional shapes, as long as the movement of shapes is animate. Is self-propelled. Its path may be non-linear, and it may undergo sudden changes in velocity. Heidegger and Simmel show that observers who viewed videos of moving triangles could not resist attributing intentional emotions and personality traits to the shapes. Numerous studies have since demonstrated this automatic attribution of high-level mental states to animate motion in adults in a wide range of cultures. Young infants and even chimpanzees Castelli and colleagues used Heidegger and Simon-like animations in a pet study in which subjects were presented with simple geometrical shapes. Triangles, the movement patterns of which evoked either mental state attribution or simple action descriptions. The results showed increased activation in association with mental state attribution in several brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporal parietal junction, the STS. As described above, the STS consistently activated by the perception of biological motion. The medial prefrontal cortex is consistently activated by theory of mind tasks in which subjects think about their own or others' mental states. Recognizing our own intentions. What is the mechanism behind this automatic attribution of intention to other people's action? Inferring intentions from observed actions might depend on the same mechanisms that labels the consequences of one's own actions as being produced by one's own interactions. There is accumulating evidence that we recognize the sensory consequences of our own intentions using a predicative forward model mechanism. The forward model automatically predicts the sensory consequences of self-generated intentions and stores the sensory predictions associated with a wide variety of motor actions. Specifically, it is proposed that during self-produced actions, the forward model uses afference copy signals that are produced in parallel with a motor command to predict the sensory consequences of the motor act. This sensory prediction is then compared with the actual sensory consequences of the act, and the results of the comparison can be used to determine the source of sensory events. I will make a little explanation and we will continue this next. So the perception action is very close to Dasein. And I would say the motor simulation corresponds to that, the world, or the thing around us. So with motion alone, they put certain dots on the bodies, and that motion alone gives all the information. No needed for details of skin or fluctuations along my lines. But the whole intention is shown just by the dots. And in the Johansson walkers, the dots are not even pretty close. They are wide apart. And in a way, this is similar to Susie Froebel's idea of the world as being fractal. Susie Froebel showed that we only need fractality, and the complexity of the world can only be expressed in fractals. That's another comparison. We have Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and fractals here, if that could be to some help. Do we have some questions here?
Thank you for presenting this paper by Sarah J Blakemore.
More than welcome.
And I checked, she teaches at the University of Cambridge,
Ooh.
so she's a very competent person. And I was thinking about if we can mention another philosopher, Heraclitus, and his Pantarei, that is everything is motion. So what is the point? Okay, let's say you once mentioned an example of a person, a ballet dancer, who was sick at the bed, and she was able to mentally rehearse the ballet. And although she was sick, I don't know, 6 months lying there, she could mentally rehearse. It showed that motion is mental. You don't have to physically, so to say, do things.
No, very good. this is where the fractality, there is no difference between what could be called corporal, what could be called mental, because the dots that depicts a human body, they are like shining things in darkness, very comparable to the ones they're using for the green figures in movies. I don't know if you've seen those. But what they do essentially is transmit both intention, emotional attitude, and what we would call physical movement. And there is no difference there really. And I can recommend on YouTube these green figures, they're usually called green figures, are participating in movie these days. But of course you can't see them. They are taken away. And the whole history is a green figure looking at these movies and saying, hey, those are my relatives. Let me take them out. So he can actually show that they are participating. And in one especially fun episode of Pirates of the Caribbean, there are 3 figures moving a boat. They can't be seen, but the boat is moving. That goes to show that both what we call physical movement and mental movement is proved to be of no difference. And it's also very helpful to understand Dasein. As Heidegger says, it doesn't mean anything, my philosophy, if it's not put in a scientific, common day perspective. He wants it to be used not abstractly only, but on all levels simultaneously. Otherwise, he says, my whole deed would be gone. It is not an abstract theory of looking at literature or something like that. Oh, sorry, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.